Hey, how's the volume doing? Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to my talk about dialogue craft. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rebecca Evanhoe. I work for a company called Mobiquity. We design digital experiences, and of course, I focus on voice design. So we've made a couple dozen Alexa skills, and we also work on Google Home Actions and chatbots. So today I'm going to talk specifically about writing dialogue that's meant to be read aloud by a non-human. And that's going to be the focus of this talk. I think most of you know this, but almost everything that Alexa and Google say are written by humans. So I'm going to be covering a couple different things. In the first half of this talk, I'm going to give you 6 really concrete, clear guidelines for writing and editing spoken dialogue. And in the second part, I'm going to be talking about 3 processes that are going to help you iterate and edit your work. So I want to talk for a moment about what makes writing for voice experiences challenging. And I think there's a lot of talk about this with some of these folks in this crowd, so I'll just go over them quickly. So when you're writing oral copy or copy that's meant to be ingested by the ear, the listener can't skim through what they're hearing. They have to, it's input into the ear word by word, and there's really no mechanism to speed it up. And information is held in the mind. In a lot of voice experiences, there's no outsourcing of this information to a written medium. And so you're asking your listener to do a lot of work, a lot of mental work. Some of you might be familiar with the term cognitive load. It's the idea of the amount of mental processing that it takes to do a task. And listening to dialogue takes up a fair amount of cognitive load. So I'm sure you have all heard these 2 words before in relation to writing. When you're writing for voice experiences, it should be clear and it should be concise. And I want to talk for a minute about why these things are important. The reason that clarity matters is because it reduces the cognitive load. It makes it easier on the listener to ingest the information. And when you reduce cognitive load, it makes it easier for the user to understand. When you write with clarity, it also improves accessibility. So some of the people listening to your dialogue might have an auditory processing disorder, or English might not be their first language, or maybe a person is just tired, right? All of these things make it easier or make it more difficult to listen and ingest what we hear. So clarity matters because it makes your experience easier for people to interact with. The reason that concision matters is that it increases efficiency. Because people are hearing your dialogue one word at a time, when you write with concision, making things as short as possible, it actually reduces the time of your interaction and preserves people's patience. So we've reviewed these 2 principles. I hope I've succeeded in convincing you, giving you some concrete information about why they matter. And I noticed that a lot of articles and some books talk about these things, but don't actually give people information on how to write with concision and clarity. It's like, when I edit, what am I looking for? How do I know when I'm concise enough? Or how do we know when our writing is clear to more people than just ourselves? So that's what I'm going to really get down into brass tacks about. There's an extra word on that slide. And I want to talk for just a minute about where these best practices come from. These are some sources that I use for this talk and that I return to again and again. There are a lot more really great sources in addition to these, but these best practices come from radio, which has a long history of understanding how people hear information, how they can best comprehend what they hear. There's classic books like The Elements of Style. We can take lessons from the written medium as well. There's a really awesome IVR book, this voice user interface design that's fantastic. And of course, we have Kathy Pearl's book that has some information on this. And Sense of Style is a book by a neurolinguist about how the brain works when it ingests language. So these are some of my favorites, but we can come up and chat with me after if you want more sources, because there's some amazing ones out there. So we'll start at the very beginning. When you're writing dialogue, you're going to be writing two types of sentences. You're going to be writing questions, which prompt a person to respond. Questions are really important. And you're going to be writing statements that give information or context. And when you write a little chunk of dialogue, sometimes you'll be writing a single sentence or a phrase. Sometimes you'll be writing up to 3 sentences, probably not more. So here's a little sample of what a chunk of dialogue might look like. This is 3 sentences. First sentence, welcome to Goat Town. This is a skill that is fortunately imaginary. Gives you some context. If you love goat sounds, you're in the right place. Gives you additional context on what the skill is going to be used for. What's your favorite type of goat is the prompt that the user is meant to respond to. So I'm going to talk about 3 best practices for clarity, which are choosing the right question structure, partitioning your sentences, and employing parallel structure. And I'll give examples of each of these. And I'm going to be talking also about best practices for concision. And these are eliminating verb clusters, using conversational phrases, and reducing sentences by 1 word. And I'll get into the nitty-gritty of all of these. So the first one is the one we'll spend the most time on, choosing the right question. So the way that you ask your users a question, the way that you word your prompt really impacts the way that they're going to respond. So you have to be really careful about the way you're wording your question to make sure that you're going to maximize the chance of your user returning the kind of information that you want. So there are a bunch of different types of questions. I am going to talk about all of these. I'm a big question fan. So these are the 5 categorizations that I find useful. If you look at literature in different fields, people categorize questions a little bit differently. So these are the categorizations that I find useful. So I'm going to start by talking about open-ended questions. These are questions like, what can I help with? How are you feeling today? These are really natural questions, and they're a great way to start an interaction, but you want to use them kind of sparingly and carefully because they result in highly varied user responses. So you can imagine, what can I help with? If I don't know what the skill does exactly, I could say a lot of things in response to that. Or if I say, how are you feeling today? There's almost an infinite way that that question can be answered. So because these questions result in highly varied answers, you want to make sure that your underlying grammar system can handle it, and that's what makes these challenging. So when you know what your system is listening for, let's say it's listening for specific categories or keywords, or something more like an answer in the form of a question, you want to word your question in a way that's going to maximize your user answering in the right way. So in this first one, what can I help with? It's pretty broad, and a user might say bill payment if they think that's something the skill can do for them. Versus if you phrase it, what's your question? The user is more likely to answer in the form of a question. If you ask a question like, how are you? A user could say I'm fine, or having a good day, or mediocre. But if you ask something more specific, like how are you feeling today, the user is more likely to give you information about their health state or their mental state. So you can see that once you know what your skill is actually trying to listen for, you want to target your question to get the user to say something along those lines. The next question type is menu questions. These are really essential when you're making any kind of voice experience. So examples of this would be, which is your favorite, dogs or turtles, or which of the following symptoms do you have? So they actually contain lists. You see these a lot when you're making voice experiences in the beginning of an interaction or oftentimes in help menus. You use them when you need the person to pick from a specific set of options. As you can imagine, if you give too many options, it's really hard for the user to process them. So you want to limit it to 3 to 4. Once you get to 5, people stop remembering all of the options and they need to ask to repeat and things get a little messy. When you are using menu questions, you also want to employ parallel structure, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next question type is quantifying questions. These are questions that are trying to get the user to return some kind of number. So how many guests are you expecting? When would you like this delivery? What time will your event start? When you're writing quantifying questions, again, you want to know what your system is listening for. And we'll talk about why here. So in this example, if you ask a question like, when do you want to leave? Let's say your system is listening for a time. A user could interpret this question as asking for a date, like Tuesday, or they could interpret the question as asking for a time, 4 p.m. So depending, if, in this example, let's say our system is listening for a time, the users who say Tuesday are going to get some kind of error message. So it's better to have a more specific question, like if your system is listening for a date, say what date. If your system is listening for a time, say what time. Next, location questions. These also, in a similar vein, you want to be specific about what kind of location you're asking for. And similar to when, remember that where can prompt a lot of different responses. So in this example, you could say, where do you want to go? If you don't give the user any context, they could say New York City. They could say an address, or they could say Brian's house if they sort of have an assumption that your skill can be that specific. So with location questions, you do want to be specific about what kind of information you're trying to elicit. So what's your destination city versus something like what's your destination airport? You want to be as specific as possible. Yes or no questions. These come up a lot in skills as well. So do you want to continue? Do I have that right? Are you ready? More. These yes or no questions really are best when they're used for confirmation only. And you want to keep them short. Like you can see on the left here, we start with like a complete sentence or a complete question. And at the end, we just get down to one word. People are really comfortable with yes or no questions, so it's a good opportunity to use short phrases. And there is one pitfall with yes or no questions that I hear a lot in voice experiences. It's when you have the beginning of a question that is like a yes or no question, but the end is a menu question. So do you have any of the following symptoms, fever, nausea, or aching? Because the sentence starts with the word do, the user is kind of primed to answer yes or no, no matter what comes after. So they could say no, they could say yes, or they could say one of these symptoms like fever, but you're kind of asking them 2 different question types at once, and you're going to get varied responses. So in these instances, figure out what you're actually trying to do. Are you trying to get the user to say one of the symptoms? If so, just use a menu question. And if you are trying to get confirmation, then you'll want to ask a yes or no question. Okay, so that's probably more than you expected to get about questions. And we'll move on to the rest of the tips. So the second one is partitioning your sentences. And I'll give some examples of what this means. So it's basically the idea is you need to figure out if your sentence can be broken up into different clauses or phrases and organize those clauses or phrases carefully. And the guiding principles for doing this are that you want to keep the subject and verb together. This is something that radio editing talks about a lot. It's just really easy, much easier for people to ingest information when the sentences have clear subjects and verbs. They come together, so you understand their relationship easily. And you want to place the important information last. The information that you want a user to remember should come at the end. So here's an example of keeping the subject and verb together. So in an example that's not written so easily to understand, the checkout time for the Best Western in Newark is 2 p.m. So the subject is checkout time, the verb is, and the important information is 2 p.m. 2 p.m. comes last, so that's good. But it's a little easier for a person to understand when you put all of your contextual information at the beginning of a sentence. So the context is for the Best Western in Newark. And then the meat, the thing that the person really needs to understand is that the checkout time is 2 p.m. So you can see in the second example, it's not broken up, and it's just going to take a little less cognitive load to get through. In the second example, choose a theme to get started ordering t-shirts. So this is already partitioned a little bit in the first example, but the important information that we want the user to act on is choose a theme. So it'll be better for the user if we put choose a theme at the very end of the sentence. So to start your t-shirt order, choose a theme. All right, next tip is employ parallel structure. And this one is tricky. It comes up a lot when you're writing menu questions, and it's something that it can be a little tricky to figure out how to wrangle the different things, the different category or menu items into parallel structure. So parallel structure means you're trying to get repeated elements of a sentence into a grammatically equivalent structure. So if you're making a list, it could be all nouns, shirts, pants, accessories. It could be all gerunds or words that end in ing, so cooking, cleaning, or shopping. Or you could make them all short phrases with, let's just say verb direct object phrases. Pay bill, check balance, transfer funds. So here's an example of a sentence that's not in parallel structure. I can teach you about fishing, how to hunt, or golf tips. Which one? So you can see, this isn't too difficult to understand, but it is a little awkward on the ear. And it makes the user a little confused about what they're supposed to say. I might try to say like how to fish or hunting. It creates a little bit of variance or confusion. The user has to think a little harder to answer. So we could change it to all nouns. I can teach you how to fish, golf, or hunt. Which one? In the second example, how do you want to travel? Airplane, take a bus, or by train. Not parallel structure. These are all sort of grammatically different. So we can choose to either, there's a lot of different ways to handle this, but in the example here, I made them all nouns. Pick a mode of transportation, airplane, train, or bus. Fourth tip is eliminating verb clusters. And this comes up in every first draft that I've ever written, and I think it's very easy to do when you're trying to figure out what your skill should say. So when you're writing your first draft, you can very easily make a sentence that says, I will try to be able to help you. What's your question? I did this earlier this week. You can, first version is fine for your first draft, but you want to get it closer to something like, I can help. What's your question? So we've just reduced this phrase by a lot of words. Another example would be something like, Wine Master will get you started understanding and enjoying wine. A lot of verbs in different forms here. So get you started, understanding and enjoying. There's this whole middle part of the sentence is just kind of a jangle. So in this instance, you want to just pick something like, what is the primary verb? What's a single verb that demonstrates how I'm going to how a person can use the skill. So Wine Master teaches you how to appreciate wine. So I've chosen the verb teach. as the primary verb in the sentence, and then appreciate is kind of standing in for both understanding and enjoying. Next, and this is something people talk about a lot, using conversational phrases. It's really easy in first drafts to write incomplete sentences, and then as you revise, you want to work more toward short phrases. And because platforms like Alexa and Google are very specifically meant to be conversational and casual, phrases are fine. People understand them fine. So in your first draft, you might write something like, I thought I heard you say 2 large popcorns. Would you like anything else? Grammatically, it's fine, but there are shorter ways to say it so we can just preserve some of the user's time. We can say, okay, 2 large popcorns. Anything else? And these should be experienced like a user will comprehend both of these equally, but one takes a lot less time. And sort of related to this is the last tip, which is to go through and reduce all of your sentences that you've written by 1 word. This is one of my favorite activities in life, and it can be a little addictive, so be careful. In this example, it says, next, I can give more details about flights for this trip. So if I'm trying to, I'm giving myself the challenge to reduce every sentence by 1 word, I might reorganize the final phrase. So instead of for this trip, it's this trip's flights. So I've reduced it by a single word. And then I might realize, the listener has been focusing on this one specific trip they're planning for the entire interaction, so they know what trip I'm talking about. So I can just say, next I can give more details about flights, because they know that I'm not talking about all flights in the world. They're talking about this one that we've been working with together. So here's one example. Yeah. It's okay to put you in, but the person knows you're talking to them, so it's not required for them to sort of understand. So it can be a little bit of an extra word. So in this example, this is just another example of reducing by 1 word. All right, I'll repeat this back to you. That's 2 adult tickets to see Lady Bird on Friday, July 27th at 7 p.m. Is that right? So the opportunity here, I eliminated the 2 you because the user knows I'm talking to them. And then in the next example, the words to see here, I don't need to say to see, I can say for. I decided I didn't have to say I'll repeat this back because that's inherent in what the voice is doing. And in the final one, I got rid of July 27th because, let's presume, if the context is it's talking about this upcoming Friday, then we can just say Friday if the context is clear enough. And then I changed, is that right, to correct. So in the initial version, it's 25 words, and in the final one, it's 14. And you can do this and just feel really good about the rest of your day. So that gets us through all of these nice concrete tips. So the next time you're writing dialogue, you can sit down and your first draft is going to come out how it comes out, and that's fine. And then when you start editing and revising what you're doing, you can use these tips for specific things to look for. And now I want to talk about processes, and specifically about writing iteratively. And I also want to talk about the importance of copy editing, things that you're going to be presenting to a group of people. So the idea of iterating comes up in tech a lot. We know that agile processes, we talk about agile, you can apply some of that thinking to your writing. So when you write iteratively, you're trying to move closer to a desired result with repetition. So the idea is you don't have to make it perfect in one go. You don't have to make it perfect in 2 goes. Typically, we write our dialogue and edit and revise a minimum of 5 to 10 times. So this might sound like a lot of work, but it's actually very freeing. You don't have to get it right. You just have to find a couple things each time and make it better. And to me, that takes a lot of the pressure off. So the processes that I'm going to talk about are reading aloud to yourself, table reads, and workshopping. And these are common techniques. Workshopping is something used in writing programs a lot, and it's something I've experienced with, and it's really helpful. And I've used these techniques in all of my sort of dialogue writing jobs. What's helpful about them are, one, they put you into this position where you are writing iteratively. So if you do each of those 3 things and you revise after, then you're already getting through 3 passes on your dialogue, which is really great. Another thing that it does is I think that writing doesn't have to be a solitary activity, and just like any other form of design, when you bring in more minds, it makes your product better. So collaborating in your writing is something that people probably could do more, and these techniques help you do that. So reading aloud to yourself, this isn't too foreign a concept to us. So here's how you do it. You sit somewhere where you can speak out loud, and you read to yourself. The thing that I like about reading aloud is that it helps you identify some of these specific things. It helps you start to hear some of the best practices stuff that we talked about in the beginning. So when you're reading aloud, you can really start to hear where your sentences are kind of jumbled up. So you can partition your sentences better. Like, you'll sort of realize, like, oh, this is a little bit muddled. You will start to hear those verb clusters will really jump out to you. Reading aloud is really helpful for identifying really any form of wordiness. And then you'll also start to hear some of these places where you can reduce sentences by 1 word. These things just sort of start to jump out at you. Next one, table read. You can find 1 friend. That's all you need. And then read your dialogue out loud as you've written it. So you're playing the part of the virtual assistant. And let your friend respond naturally. So just let them answer the question, just like they would if you were Alexa. In this instance, you'll start to hear places where you've asked them a question and they gave an answer you weren't expecting. So that is usually an indicator that your question structure is not as specific as it could be. And when you'll start to hear places where you have not employed parallel structure, because you might present options to your friend who's listening, and they might struggle or stumble for a minute trying to figure out what to say back to you, which menu item to choose. And last, workshop, which is the closest one of these to a party. Find at least 2 friends, and you're going to distribute your copy in advance and let them read it and take notes. They're going to identify all kinds of stuff. Once they've taken their notes, you want to meet with them for 20 or 30 minutes. And the discussion part is actually really important. Like, they could throw their notes over the fence. But this discussion really helps you write iteratively. It really helps you think through optimizing what you've written. So your friend might come to you and say, like, hey, I thought this was wordy here. And you might respond like, I think you're right, but what I'm trying to do is this, because this idea is really important to the listener at this moment. And then the third friend might say, oh, okay, well, maybe there's a third way to do this, and come up with an idea. So this group brainstorming is really important when you're talking about picky stuff like language. So make sure you don't skip the discussion portion. And specifically, one really good thing that comes out of a workshop is that you'll start to hear where maybe you've got a whole sentence and you can, like, as a group, discuss how some of these phrases could be more natural. So these are 3 processes that we talked about. And do you have another question? Actually, let me wrap up, and then we have plenty of time for questions, because this has been pretty swift. So what I want to end on is that I do think that writing is a form of design, and we don't do design alone, or design is much, the process is much better when we do it in a community. We create some mind share and use other people's brains to optimize what we're doing. Even when you're writing, novels, you're not writing alone. Writing is always better with more eyes on it and with discussion. And especially if you're writing for a social experience, like conversation, the more humans you get in on it, the better it's going to be. And that leaves us plenty of time for questions. So, I think, thanks. So I think we have a question here.
For when you are workshopping,
Mhm.
you're doing a conversation with branching and stuff like that. How actively do you workshop?
Yep. Do you mean, like, how do you document it for your friends to hand it over?
You simulate the user giving responses.
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so in a table read, you're actually, like, running through the script and, like, picking, like, here's a pathway through the experience, and you're, like, reading through that. In workshopping, you are sort of handing over the whole set, and like you're saying, the dialogue could be for different scenarios, and it's sort of hard to indicate branching. So depending on how familiar your readers are with voice skills, you might want to divide it up into, like, different sections, like, and give some contextual scenario information, right? So you could be like, okay, scenario 1, here's the script. How does this go? Scenario 2, here's the script. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? Yeah. Yeah, you are identifying a very difficult problem, right? So there are a bunch of different things that you can do. And the nice thing about writing iteratively is that you can, like, try something and do a table read and be like, okay, we heard that 3 times. That's no good. So when you're getting someone to go through an ordering process, there's often a lot of pressure to confirm each choice that they're making, and you don't necessarily have to do that, right? Like I want to order a t-shirt. Okay, what size? Large. I heard large, is that correct? Yes. Okay, what color? Teal. I heard teal. Like, you don't have to confirm it in each step. You can kind of save it. And then in terms of, like, reading back the order, yeah. I would figure out which details are not required, figure out which details, when, if read aloud, are just kind of impossible to process. And if you're doing, like, an experience that allows you to send, like, a card, or if it's a multimodal experience, put the finest level of detail into the card. Because sometimes if you read a block of information that if it contains too much information, then it's worse than nothing, or, like, it's literally useless, like the user isn't picking up any part of it. So put the most essential details into the confirmation and then put really picky details in the card. Is that helpful? Is that stuff that you already knew? Yeah. We can chat more about it. It's a hard problem. I don't think there's like a ready solution right now. Yeah.
So there was a focus on writing script. About the responses. So I had this experience with Alexa where I said, Alexa, how many tablespoons in a cup? And she just spun. And I screamed at her, I spoke really loudly, and then I said, how many tablespoons are in? And then she responded. And I was like, oh, okay, you have to have this very scripted,
Yeah.
proper grammar question. So when you are creating your script and you're doing the table read, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
do you also write down everything that the users and then input that into the program
Mm-hmm.
so that improperly stated sentences there's a response?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes total sense. So when you're building either an Alexa skill or a Google Home action, they have you write, on the Alexa side, they call it sample utterances, and on the Google Home side, they call it training data, but you're writing a set of sentences. Now, both groups say that, like, it should be flexible, right? Like, your question kind of should have worked. Ideally, these systems should work so that you don't have to like nail a question, like know exactly how to ask it to get an answer. But when you're writing these sets, usually we start out by writing like 5 and like kind of putting those in the code. And then when we do either testing or table reads or we just get other people brainstorming, we flesh the list out to like 20 or 30, because if you get too many, then the system recognition can go down. Yeah, you can come up with 20 or 30 variants. Table reads and workshopping are really good places to get those, and then also, of course, like user testing. You want to capture specific phrases they're using and see if you've got those in your queue. Yeah. Yeah, this should be the next talk. Error messaging is really can be really complicated, but so a really common error is like a unhandled or fallback error where like the skill just didn't understand what you said, and in an error message like that, we often write very explicitly like I'm listening for you to say a date, because a lot of times the user might not know what they're supposed to be returning. If something like that comes up in a menu, we'll be explicit and say like, I'm listening for you to choose one of these 4 things. Here they are. There's all kinds of other errors, but in general, there's the sort of concept that I would describe as like, you want to like, what's the expression, lift the 4th wall or go beyond the 4th wall or whatever, and sort of very explicitly, make it clear, like, I am a computer and I am listening for data. Like, at that point, you want to kind of be explicit about what the user needs to do to move forward. Yeah.
Do you think that speech patterns will change as people are interacting with these systems more? So, like in the example of the cups, like just dropping the R or having the R in there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think people alter their speech patterns based off of the systems that they're using, especially for kids who are growing up with?
Yeah, I mean, do you mean like, do I think this will change the way society communicates?
I know that's a heady question, but
No, I'm very into this question. What do I think? I think that, language always evolves, and we know this, and like, has the English language collapsed into grunts now that we're like texting and using emojis? Like, we don't go around and just make faces at each other because our language atrophied and we can just speak in pictures. I think that these systems will just get better, and we won't have our communication with like Alexa or Google Assistants or anything else they'll just get better, and we can just talk like ourselves. In the meantime, so Kathy Pearl gave a talk yesterday, and she said that humans, and I tweeted about this because it was so interesting to me, humans repair a conversation, like amend or clarify or reroute or say, oh, sorry, I misheard you, like every 84 seconds. So humans are already rephrasing themselves all the time. It's like a very natural thing for us to do. So I think that we do it. I mean, it sounds like you had a frustrating experience, but but you rephrased yourself like you would with a person, and then it went okay. So I think that both the speech recognition and people will just continue to get more flexible with each other. I'm going to see what Russ wants to say. Like how much time should you allow for iterating on? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So if your skill, so we did a banking skill and a movie ticket ordering skill, and these skills are very big. And so the timeline for these skills is pretty long. I would say that when I first write dialogue, it's total crap, and I don't even worry about it. We have to figure out other stuff. And this is all internal, right? Like, this is not stuff we're flashing to our customers. But you just want to block it out. Like, it's supposed to say something like this, and the question's going to be something like this. These iterative processes, I would say it takes like a couple days to get a first pass at dialogue once you've figured out all your skill features and like its general structure. Then I would move into using some of these techniques and working through it with developers, with fellow designers, with other people who can stand in for users, and internally working through it. And that can take maybe like a couple weeks. So if you're doing working on it on your own and doing a table read and doing a workshop, then you want a couple days in between to like update and change your dialogue. So that can take a couple weeks. And then you've got pretty good copy to start user testing. And then your user testing is going to give you, identify any refinements you need to make and give you a sense of some of those utterances. And we all know like user testing, depending on how many testers you have, can be a couple weeks. This is all in parallel to other things in the skill development. But I do think copywriting often gets shortchanged, and it often is viewed as like, okay, well, somebody did everything else, and now the copywriter just has to edit it. But to properly do it, you need to like deeply understand the function of each step of the skill. And so at minimum, your copywriter needs to have enough information to know each step. Let's see, you have a question? Oh, you mean like for like information that we put into like a Mhm. That's a great question. It depends on how you're using your visual medium. If you're using it as more, like you can just put verbatim what you want, like your assistant's dialogue into your visual medium. It's probably better to, in a visual medium, to use it more as of a summary and make it more skimmable. Because if someone's hearing something and they're reading something at the same time, they might just want like keywords or sort of bulleted structures. So when people are hearing a sentence read aloud to them and viewing a sentence, they're just going to read the whole sentence and they're not going to hear what's being said. So it creates some like dissonance. So in general, your visual mediums you want to be like even more concise than your spoken. And the visual mediums don't have to be conversational at all. They can just be informational, like lists or bulleted phrases. Does that answer your question a little bit? Or do you have a different opinion? Yeah, the movie ticket one sent, it was an Alexa skill, and it sent cards at the summary stage, like the pre-order stage, and also during movie browsing. So you could hear the lists of movies to choose from, and then you could also see a list. We also sent a card with theaters when you're in the choose a theater step. So yeah, we sent these sort of bulleted lists throughout the experience, yeah. Let's see, question?
And I'm sorry that I took the notes and you might have covered this at the top, but what kind of feedback or input do you get from the customer first? I mean, how do you map the experience that you're looking for from their customer perspective to you? Do you like shadow the customer in a sense? How do you kind of get that kind of data? And how much input do you get that from the customer if they look for you to that user first? And you get that back from before you start?
I mean, like before we start like designing a skill?
Before you start to design the dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, we would, in a beautiful world full of fully funded UX research, yeah, you talk to the customers, you find out what their pain points are, and when you choose what you want your skill to do, it should be deeply tied to solve some problem for the users. Like, it should make ordering movie tickets faster. Let's say you find out most of your users go to the same movie theater every time. Your skill should make that assumption. So, yeah, I mean, that should undergird sort of all the features in your skill. And of course, the dialogue serves the structure of your skill and its purpose. But yeah, I don't know. Do any of you get to do as much user research as you want to? Did you have a question?
Yeah. In a nice world, I won't say perfect. What would be? I'm still trying to picture how different areas of concern in the development process are divvied up among different roles.
Mhm.
You've got your writers, you've got your designers, your script designers, I
Mhm.
guess. So one of my questions is, in a nice world, what's a good starting point for a writer to have everything they need to feel like they can get the initial scope on it and have a good place to iterate from?
Mhm.
So what they need and who are they talking to
Mhm.
get that going?
That is a great question. I do, this isn't the way that it always works, but at my company, I do both the flow design and the dialogue design, and I do them at the same time. So I'll like figure out the user needs and how the interaction needs to go, and then block out dialogue pieces that I need and draft them. So it should say something like this. It should say something like this. Then I take those pieces and meet with the devs and look for constraints that we didn't imagine, look for improvements that the devs are suggesting, and then I talk to my colleague, Erin, who's sitting over here. Who we sort of think through. You get other people involved in these things, and start your iteration process. If you are working, and we've worked with copywriters, if you're working where somebody's doing the design and then you have a copywriter who's coming in maybe a little bit later, you should walk them through the overview of the experience, walk them through the error cases, and typically give them the flow diagrams so they can refer to them. And I've never met a writer who couldn't follow a VUI flow. Like, writers are very logical, critical thinking people. So once they understand the skill and they have maybe something to refer to, they should be able to read through your list of dialogue and understand the context of each one. they'll probably, it's usually a conversation, like they'll go through and do a pass and see what questions they have, and then they might do a follow-up conversation when they work with their editing. But it is really good if you can give them the flows so that they can understand the context of each line. Over here. That is such a good question. That is such a good question. Because it's tricky, like, diversity, like, it is so important to think about how many different people are going to be listening to your dialogue and how you can make it clear for a variety of people, like, is really tricky. One thing that I have learned is that a lot of clients want, like, punchy language and like fun jargon and stuff, but all of that is not understandable to everyone. Like, what's a word I used? I used the word doozy to someone, and they were like, what? And I was like, like, a lot of times these fun words, these cute turns of phrase are regional. And so people have fun when things are simple and fast. They don't have fun when you're like, hey, y'all, this skill's a doozy, So you, like, reducing the use of those words, I think, and actually just, like, giving people a really clear experience is better. So that's one thing. And then another really concrete thing that I do is when I use, like, sample names, I make sure they're not all, like, white-sounding names. Or there are other samples like that you can make sure you're not defaulting to, like, sort of like white or male. Those are a couple, and then of course, like, testing it with a bunch of different people. Like, if there are people that you work with, English isn't their first language, see how they understand it. I think that's really an awesome question. Yes. Absolutely, I completely agree. Okay, I think that's our time. Thank you so much for these awesome questions. This was really fun.